Everyone, it's 3 o'clock, so I'm going to get started. I've got quite a bit to run through. I'm going to try and speed through some of the simpler bits. The rest of them I'm going to keep more as only important bits in depth, hopefully. But there is some questions at the end, and if I can't run through my time, please feel free to find me, around the outside area, bar, etc., and ask anything you like. So, what I want to cover is critical national infrastructure, operational technology, and industrial control systems. I'm going to try and explain what these are and give you some examples and make sure it's as clear as can be. But this is more a primer, a sort of how to get started, what kind of approach you need to take to get into this part of sort of pen testing and the services that we provide. So, who am I? My name is Joseph Foote. I'm a senior consultant working with a London cybersecurity firm, specialising in mobile hacking, so iOS and Android, but in terms of my day job, I'm doing infrastructure, web, OT, RE, fit clients, cloud, pretty much everything you can imagine, all mixed together. And then as hobbies, embedded hardware, PCB design, development, and hosting. You'll find my blog, there's a link to it, and find me on Twitter at False Privacy. They're not particularly active at the moment, so give it a little bit. Maybe a couple of weeks I'll try and get the blog live, I'll try and get things up, and you'll see some more activity. And I've got a little slide again to cover kind of things that are going to be in my blog soon, so I hope you find it interesting. So as an overview, I want to cover what critical national infrastructure is, the CIA triad, Version model, some examples of protocols that you might see in the OT environment, case studies, and if I have time, hopefully a quick demonstration of what security engagement might look like. So, what is critical national infrastructure? These are the kinds of things that are ubiquitous to your everyday life and, in a sense, necessary for most of us to live comfortably. Things like power lines, lampposts, transportation systems, motor services, water, gas, electric, communications, power plant, etc. Things that are, again, very much necessary for us to have a comfortable life and everything around us to operate smoothly. In terms of an OT network, it's an operating technology network, which is what's used to actually facilitate and run all utilities like power plants, water, gas, etc. There's a different kind of approach and mindset that needs to be taken. Primarily, communication must be ISO encrypted, so you can't have crosstalk between different systems. You need to be very careful and very selective about what goes where, how to communicate, and how it's secured. Internet access is typically non-existent. However, if there is some internet access, it will be disallowed, and ideally, purely on a whitelist basis for what can go out. So that might be some update URLs, that might be your next patches, it might be a very specific corporate resource that has to be accessible. But that keep it as minimal as possible, bless you. It must be always available and reliable, i.e. if they will go down, you might have no electric, no gas, your water might stop working, you might not get billed for a period. All these are problems both for business and for us. And then it must be checked against threats. So while availability is very important, you can't exactly say network can just be insecure, built anyone, or left completely wide open. There are bad actors, and they will take malicious measures given the chance. And then finally, it should be cost effective, and this works in tandem with availability, i.e. all the systems used because they're tried, tested, and they're known to be good at work. However, all systems also tend to be a little bit cheaper. You can run them for longer, keep them going, and everyone's happy because of it. Now, you might be familiar with the CIA triad in IT, so information services. In IT lands, the CIA triad says that confidentiality is number one. If a web service goes down for 10 minutes, no one really cares, so long as you use your account secure, your password's not stolen, your account isn't accessed maliciously, and then you have integrity and availability. But in OT land, availability is king. It has to come first. Next, integrity, so you can't give changing customer data, billing data, changing sensor outputs, etc. And finally, you have confidentiality. That's not to say it's not important, but the primary concern is always going to be keeping things up, online, and running. So I want to give you an example of the Persian model. And this is something we reference continuously in every OT test we do. You have to be very aware of this, and the client's going to potentially use this as a baseline architecture, a guide for how they do things. You can find this online, the many different variants of it, but typically it will look something like this. So at the very top, level 4, you have your enterprise network, that's your corporate network. That's where you walk into the office, connect your laptop, and you land on some VLAN somewhere. You'd have things like workstations, email servers, DNS servers, file shares, all that kind of thing. On 3.5, you have a DMZ, intermediate layer of sorts. So you've got a jump box, which certain individuals in the corporate might have access to, typically behind a PAM solution, so privileged access management. Say only these accounts can come through, they can access these specific IPs, they can remote into, say, this Windows machine, and they need two-factor authentication, or perhaps more than that in some cases. You have patch servers, so these will be things that will solve, for instance, your Red Hat updates and the Windows updates. However, these updates that go on the server have to be tried and tested by one of the product teams, meaning it's typically months behind your mainline updates for, say, Windows and Red Hat. And then you have a historian mirror. I'm going to dive into what historian is momentarily, but let's continue down for the time being. Level 3, you have manufacturing operations, so that's in the middle. Your engineering workstations, your main, primary historian, so that has read and write access, and file servers other bits. But let's focus on engineering workstations for a second. The engineering workstations are where technical individuals who have the authorization would be able to land on the network from that workstation and access parts of the OT environment, bits that are most critical. Again, very selective and has to be secured. However, when they try and jump down, they might have to say SCADA networks, they might have to indirectly control PLCs. It depends on the company how to set things up. The engineers typically get access to these things to do, say, code changes, perform updates, to verify the environment's running properly, and maybe in rare cases, change the code on the PLCs. And I'm going to dive into what a PLC is soon, so just hang tight for a second. Going back to the story, just for one moment to give some context for the rest of this. And the story essentially stores sensor data from the base control, so more of your sort of physical, your manufacturing side, say these are how things are operating, this is uptime, were there any errors? And engineers and perhaps sometimes slightly higher up people can reach reports, whether it be directly or indirectly from this modern network and make sure things are working, or know whether or not engineers be sent out to fix something in the physical world, not just digital, mind you. So I want to give an overview of protocols too, specifically some of the most common. There are others, Regenerator network. If you saw the talk about OT in boats before and ships, you'll find that there are quite a few variants, but for now I'm talking more in terms of power plants, energy providers, water, gas grid. These are things we're more familiar with. Modbus is a serial and or TCP protocol in some cases. Very simple. I'll give you an example of each and I'll run through what they do. You've got MP3, IEC 608705111. Quite a long name, I know. The others are simple. That one's not. Don't know why, but someone chose to be like that. But I have two variants. I've highlighted them. 101 and 104, serial and TCP respectively. And then Profinet, which can be serial or Ethernet, using factories 9 times out of 10, but there's other environments that might be necessary. Each protocol has its own pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, and use cases. And the companies that use these are conscious of it, but it can also be vendor dependent. So depending on where they buy their equipment from, they might be locked to a specific subset of protocols. For Modbus, and the serial example here, you just get a little idea of what the protocol looks like. I'm limited on time, so I'm not diving into the specifics of each, but I did want to give an overview. So I'm just going to flick through these. The TCP example 2, and one thing I want to state before I move on. Modbus is not encrypted. It might be able to be wrapped with another protocol. You could put through a private link, for example, a VPN tunnel, but you're limited in what you can do. Ideally, it should be something that's point-to-point. Serial was preferred, but by nature of it, it's harder to intercept. And attack as a Windows system, but it shouldn't be. It's going to have a harder time intercepting serial than they would with a standard TCP connection. The MP3 doesn't support encryption out of the box. However, there's a V5 variant that supports native encryption. This might be used where you've got a wider network, more access, more machines, more unknowns, more variables. We have the IAC protocol as well. You can get a sense, and I've organized in such a way that you've gone from Modbus, quite simplistic, down to the MP3, it's a little more complicated, IAC, more complicated again. Each of these are sort of an extension, there's a necessity for them to exist, and oftentimes they can read more complicated information. Finally, we have Profinet. Let's not say there aren't other protocols, but these are the examples I wanted to give as a quick overview. This is something that can be used more in factories. It's interesting because it runs on top of sort of standard Ethernet. So if you use Wireshark and you look at the frames going through and the packets going through, and you look at the frame information, you'll see the ether types. For IPv4, for example, you might see the type of hex 800. But for Profinet, you'll see something more like hex 8892. Now, there's multiple variants of Profinet, so it might be a bit different. Wireshark will identify it for you. But just as an example, I just want to give that. One thing I should mention, between these protocols, they're all used for largely the same purpose. To read sensors, instruct machines and actuators to do certain things, and to hopefully provide feedback to SCADA systems. I'm going to talk about SCADA systems shortly, but you can think of them as sort of a hub where engineers can sit, and there's control, feedback, reporting system, analytics, and general overview of factory health. Now, the attack vectors on these can range from simplistic to very complicated, but how the modern world works, the same attack vectors come again and again. Standard person in the middle for a suitably positioned attacker. Physical access. This is often mitigated quite well. You'll see in power plants and factories, those huge fences around, barbed wire, multiple doors that require a badge to get into. And then there might be more aggressive security. Let's say armed personnel that will be sitting around watching. Depending on the facility you're looking at, this can be on the very extreme side, but it definitely depends what you're looking at. And this is why hackers might refer to something like a warehouse that's directly connected to, say, the corporate network, the operational technology network, etc. However, has less security, be it physical or digital. And finally, have your common phishing and compromised employees. So whether it's a malicious insider or someone that's being coerced into helping with an attack down, which is to conduct. Now, I want to make this into a bit more of a real world thing. Most of you probably heard of Stuxnet before, but if you haven't, don't worry, you have a refresher. I appreciate the picture a little bit hard to see in the background. I've put a darker background on it. The projector's not as bright as my team at home. However, you see these metal cylinders here? These are uranium enrichment centrifuges. On the outside, I believe, in the best of my research, there are cooling pipes to keep the centrifuges at a certain temperature. There's some scientists in the background, various mechanical equipment, and essentially these would be used to heat uranium ore and enrich it to make it into something more suitable for nuclear fuel. We're going to talk about that in a bit more detail too. As a disclaimer, all of this is the best of my knowledge. Stuxnet is not exactly the best documented thing. A lot of it is hearsay, people claiming that they were in the know and they put out information about it, but does not say any of it's guaranteed to be factual. So please take it with your soul, make it your own mind, and do your research as you need to do if you're interested. It is not a sort of direct acquisition or fusion story. It's a one singular person, entity, or multiple entities. That is left to you to research as you please, and it's intended to be educational. So please don't use this break its own factories. Key terms as a quick refresher: OT's operational technology, ICS industrial control systems, and we've got SCADA as a supervisory control and data acquisition. These will make more sense as I go down more, I promise. Programmable logic controllers, those are your PLCs. and then they are programmed with something called ladder logic. It's a quick overview, which is a lot of notes in that. Ladder logic can be thought of as a stack of nested statements with conditions to be met, actions to be performed, and then more depth as they go along. And sometimes a back out or forward. It depends on the system they're controlling. So what is Stuxnet? Or what was Stuxnet maybe? Stuxnet is a worm. It means spread between device to device, computer to computer, replicates itself, and in this case was highly sophisticated. In fact, security researchers that reverse engineered it said they spent months and months. Instead of taking 1 day to reverse engineer something what it did, they took 3 to 6 months, and they credited that as both being well written and highly sophisticated. Stuxnet targeted Iran's nuclear enrichment program in their Natanz nuclear facility. It was the first major publicly disclosed malware target, specifically ICS systems, industrial control systems. And its code name was Olympic Games, OG. Just want to throw it in there because it's interesting. Finally, Stuxnet was confirmed and approved, and this is speculation, but although it was never admitted, a lot of evidence points towards it, being confirmed by George W. Bush and later Barack Obama when he came into power. So, who investigated it? We have Symantec, Kirby Labs, Langer Group, which I believe is 1 or 2 individuals, maybe a larger group now, but the top of my head, and Microsoft. So, no worries. Timeline. Now, again, speculation here, listen to hearsay. The generally accepted theory it was in development since around 2005. Retrospectively, its first known deployment was mid-2009, discovered in mid-2010, and slightly after that, analysis began by various security groups, including Symantec, who had it first, who did the best job, they argued with each other, very hard to say. And finally, Stuxnet was disclosed around 2012, but there were early accounts and forms and messaging boards, so exactly how far back you take it, it's up to you. The culprit. Now, it wasn't officially attributed to any one threat actor. No one officially claimed it, and perhaps no one wanted to. But the evidence points to a joint operation by the UK, US, and Israel. Specifically, the NSA in the US, CIA, and the military cyber command. Within the NSA, the TAO, so the Tailored Access Operations Branch, were essentially credited as developing the malware due to its sophistication. As a little bit of trivia, accounts say that people walking around there were mega nerds who wore capes and had like plugins on their desks, but they are the most elite hackers in the world, so make of that what you will. Within the UK, GHQ, primarily for Intel, and then Israel's Unit 8200, Intel and Action. Likely cost hundreds of millions or more on development, but as far as government programs know, that figure's probably times 10 or 100. And then finally, while not directly attributed to Stuxnet, multiple assassinations were reported, specifically of high-ranking individuals, scientists involved in the program, and whistleblowers alongside people that may or may not have introduced the malware into the environment. The method and exploitation. So Stuxnet used Windows 0 days, or 0 days to be specific, we're going to talk about those shortly, but it also pivoted through network shares, insecure and vulnerable services, mainly vulnerable to the 0 days they discovered, machines on the network, nearby companies and contractors, and what I mean by that is vendors, nearby technical support companies, people that provide the equipment, all were infected, so it's a very targeted and very sophisticated attack. But, as the story goes, apparently they just dropped some USB sticks outside and people plugged them in. I don't know if that's true, because it sounds silly, but it could quite well be. It was early cybersecurity times. This is a Siemens PLC, specifically the S7-300 model. In the Iranian nuclear facility, the enrichment plant, they use S7-300 and the 400 model. I want to give a quick sort of visual of what this is so you can get an idea of the size and its purpose. On the front you have indicator lights, monitoring, diagnostics, etc. But this machine essentially would have a connection to the SCADA computers, the devices that can program monitoring them. it would have reported sensor feedback to this SCADA equipment, and it would have had various runs of cabling to control things like motors, lights, inlets for air, oil pumps, all kinds of things like that. So what was the purpose of Stuxnet? Why do we think, again, best guess is they did it? Well, panic, disruption, causing significant delays to the Iranians' enrichment program and prevention of Iran's nuclear program and potential weapons. The US had run out of diplomatic and passive means to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons, or as they would put it, they're trying to make some nuclear reactors. They need some very enriched fuel. But apparently the isotope they were using was unsuitable for power plant, very suitable for nuclear warheads.
Detailed.
So, weigh it up. The US had their concerns. They tried, and they knew, supposedly, if they didn't take action, Israel claimed they would. They would bomb the plant ineffectively because it was so far underground. That would cause tensions within the Middle East. And Israel apparently would expect the US to finish the job they started after they got shot down, using a huge amount of air defense. They had this innocent plants. So the initial entry was spent a little bit, but supposedly USB flash drives, as unbelievable as that is, people just pick them up and plugging them in, and that led to Stuxnet going onto an AGF network, a network that was intended to be off the internet, completely inaccessible, have its most critical part, air gaps in multiple layers of both distance and physical security. Now, my best guess from everything I've read and researched is the compromised employees' machines. They jump between security boundaries and leverage the aforementioned false security within 0 days to gain privileged access to the machines and the network. To do this, they required to digitally sign the malware. Now, you would think the US government could go to Microsoft and say, give us some certificates to sign things with, but apparently that was too obvious. Instead, they decided to steal from two companies based in, two Taiwanese companies, Realtek and J-Micron. Realtek, I don't know if this was related to Stuxnet, revoked their certificate, so they stole a second one next door. I don't mean, I'm not joking, they just released this of the company next door, and they stole that one instead. Researchers, reporters, journalists, they claim these networks were highly secure, sophisticated, that no one could have possibly claimed but the most specialist of agents. However, in practice, there's a good chance the certificates were on an SMB share. With the guest factory, so yeah. And then finally, earlier entry was suspected because of the intimate knowledge they have of the internal network within the enrichment plants. Supposedly, the US had sent several employees again and again for regulatory reasons to put things like little special anti-tamper devices on centrifuges, storage locations, etc., and equally make sure that the grams of nuclear material matched the expected outputs and nothing being stolen. During that time, there was a good chance they could have got some kind of device into the network and found a way to begin mapping it. And apparently Stuxnet also mapped things, so both the way it came in and exited by external media, it would condense the network map and the machine information into its own binary. So when it left the estate on, say, a USB stick or something else that it had access to with its bounds, it would self-report that information back once it escaped to the internet. So I can't get ultra. Development, again, under the TAO group, and supposedly, as the story goes, they had a replica of a centrifuge, the same kind used in the enrichment plants, and they managed to destroy it from controlling a PLC. So they spun it up to around 1,300 RPM, so heads per minute, for the main motor within the centrifuge. This caused the sort of banana-shaped arm inside to cause a resonant frequency within the device, causing it to slowly but surely disintegrate itself. Once they managed this, apparently they flew out to the White House, the team, dumped it in front of George W. Bush, and once he picked up the pieces and was satisfied they were strong enough, he gave go-ahead for the program to have reality. So what did the target logic look like? This was very sophisticated. This is the reason that Stuxnet probably didn't affect people at home or other companies. Well, it looked for seamless Step 7 controlled PLCs and the SCADA software that programmed Step 7 PLCs. Specifically because the SCADA software would have the necessary information, the keys and access to program these PLCs. So it makes sense to infect the SCADA part of the estate. Again, it looked for the S7-300 and 400 models specifically, because they knew that was within use. Wanting again to into knowledge of the internal estate, and equally probably to records of what they'd purchased from the nearby vendors. Look for specific network layout, system information, PLC information, down to things like time parameters and raw serial numbers of the batteries they had ordered. And it looked for 6 groups of 164 systems. We're expanding that now to make it a bit more clear. Within these groups were Group 1, and centrifuge systems, so we actually used enriched material among other things. These were made from carbon fibre and metal, run at high RPM. Very sensitive, supposedly quite poorly made, perhaps for cost reasons. But if anyone knows about how different metal materials interact, carbon fibre shrinks when it's heated, metal expands. So you can imagine a very temperamental devices that need to be kept at a specific temperature, used a specific way, and actively protected. For Group 2, the frequency converters, these were the things that ran the actual motors within the centrifuge to make them spin. And for Group 3 and 6, slightly less important, you had backup systems, configuration, engineering systems, analysis systems, etc. But this wasn't as important for Stuxnet. What did that process look like? Well, first and foremost, to evade detection, Stuxnet was pretty much invisible, and it remained that way for a very long time until good reasons, which we're going to talk about as well. It exploited and injected malicious data logic into PLCs via the bus protocol, but also via Step 7 as well. Now, its goal was to manipulate centrifuge feed, so the motor feed, that's through the Foote controllers, again, controlled by PLCs directly, and that would spin them up to 1,300, resident frequencies would cause them to break down, explode, whatever it happens to be, but in a fairly safe way for the staff around, and it would spin them down to around 2 hertz, which my best guess is this caused that motors overheat, or also break down, or perhaps other problems of how heating elements and the different materials interact it. And then finally, or not finally quite, it would send false information to operators. So they planned this out quite well. They captured information on the network for around somewhere between 13 to 30 days, depending on who you asked. They then replayed this information back to SCADA systems for this whole time. I'm like putting a camera in front of a CCTV camera, and just replaying the whole like a movie. So they thought it was operating fine. The engineers could hear the machine spinning up and breaking down rapidly. They didn't know why. They tried best to fix it, but they couldn't. They didn't know what the source was due to this malware. And finally, between attacks, in slowly breaking things, they would return the PLCs to normal operation to avoid suspicion. So they planned this out well. It was a sophisticated attack, and it was a very complex piece of malware that had to be self-sufficient. Remember, this is an air-gapped network, so you can't really reach out to the internet to a sort of command and control a C2 server and ask what to do. It has to be able to perform anything by itself. It has to be very smart and very well built.
Check things.
How long have I got?
You're a couple minutes over already.
Oh, okay. Let me run through a piece a bit more quicker. So you've got some zero-day views, you can research them yourself. The damage was about 1,000 centrifuges, 2 years of delays, and a lot of financial costs. Infection spread, you can skip that for now. Why was it discovered? Supposedly, Israel's Unit 8200 pushed for more aggressive action and ended up shutting down rebooting machines worldwide. They removed the restrictions, basically, and let it free, and they got it discovered and ruined the entire program up to that extent. Iran's response, well, they performed DDoS against US banks. They wiped 30,000 computers of a Saudi oil company, causing massive problems. And they sent packages of water down, but apparently the floodgate was offline, so they couldn't input it. I don't know how that works, but fair enough. Prevention, I think it's fairly obvious, don't bring USBs in. Train employees make months under risk, software policies in place, and isolate a network. We're going to skip past the bit about how to do a sort of security assessment at limited time, but I do want to talk a tiny bit about upcoming research. Currently looking at building a debug adapter to get into an Apple Watch. So it's got a interface on it which you can actually exploit. I'm going to use that, and I'm going to reverse engineer what I can. Export that against NAS, iOS end day, 0 day research coming up. Actually just a suggestion, so forget about those, they barely exist. There's always ways around them. My other advice on Red Team, I think that'd be really cool. They've got a lot of access to corporate resources. GSM hacking and wiretapping, this one's going to be fun, so looking forward to that. Mobile data might not be related, you decide. Functional bespoke CPU, custom operating system, and some control hardware. With that, any questions? Be quick, but if not, we might have to run outside. Probably we have time for questions.
No time for questions.
Okay,
Yeah.
find me outside after the sort of next talk, next break, and we'll talk about it then. Thank you very much.